The broadcast went out at 0600 Galactic Standard Time. Every screen, every feed, every signal receiver in every inhabited system picked it up. The Council had prepared the message for 3 years. They had chosen the words carefully, tested the translations in 47 languages, made sure the tone was right, not angry, not cruel, firm, the way a person sounds when they are closing a door that should have been closed long ago. The Vethrani delegate stood at the center of the council floor. He was tall, gray-skinned, old in the way that only patience makes a person old. He read the declaration without looking up from the screen in his hands, and his voice carried the calm of a man who had already decided the outcome. Humanity had been given time, guidance, every reasonable opportunity to become part of the galactic order. And humanity had, in the language of the formal declaration, demonstrated a persistent and statistically unacceptable pattern of unpredictability, aggression, and resistance to civilizational modeling. The Galactic Council was formally entering a state of corrective military engagement with the human species. The war was beginning. The Council expected the human response to look a certain way. They had run the models. They had watched Earth for 80 years. They knew the pattern. Denial first, then panic, then the governments turning on each other, then the fracturing. Humans fell apart under pressure. It was in the data. Every historical conflict, every resource war, every political collapse, all of it catalogued, analyzed, and fed into projection systems that had never been wrong. They watched the Earth feeds. They were not wrong about the panic. Streets filled. Broadcasts broke each other mid-sentence. 3 heads of government issued statements that contradicted the statements they had issued 20 minutes earlier. Markets closed, then opened, then closed again. The human internet, a thing the Council had studied extensively and still found deeply confusing, became a single massive noise, all of it at once, in every direction, about everything and nothing with equal force. The Council's senior analyst watched the feeds from his station above the chamber floor and made a note. Consistent with predictive model. No deviations. Proceed. He had been an analyst for 31 years. He had never been wrong. The facility had no windows. It was built that way on purpose, years ago, by a woman who understood that windows were a form of distraction, and that distraction was a form of dying slowly. The walls were plain. The lighting was flat and white. There was a coffee station in the corner that nobody had cleaned properly in 6 weeks. Commander Sela Voss had been watching the Council broadcast for 11 minutes when she turned the screen off. She was 58 years old. Her hair had gone gray at 42, and she had not done anything about it because she had not had the time, and then later because she had decided she did not care. She was not a large woman. She was the kind of thin that comes from forgetting to eat when the work is heavy. Her face had the look of a road that had been used for a long time in hard weather. She turned the screen off and picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Her aide, Lieutenant Reyes, was 29 years old and 2 months into this posting, and still operating under the belief that if you did your job well, the system rewarded you. He was standing at the door of the room, looking at her the way people look at someone they expect to be more visibly distressed. "Commander," he said, "the Council just... I heard it. What do we... Get me the ARC Committee. All 12. Tell them to come without their assistance. Tell them to come now." She walked past him into the corridor. Then he turned back to the screen she had switched off. He turned it back on, because he was thorough. Because he was the kind of man who needed to read things for himself. The Council broadcast was still running on a loop in the main feed. But in the secondary ticker at the bottom, the one that pulled from the military tracking satellites that most people did not have clearance to access, there was a small note. Easy to miss. 1 line. Council Forward Strike Fleet. Last confirmed position. Deep transit. Estimated 4 days from human territorial boundary. 4 days ago. They had left 4 days ago. Before the broadcast. Before the declaration. Before any of it was public. Reyes stared at the line. He thought about the way she had walked out of the room. No rush, no alarm. Just the flat walk of a woman, moving from one task to the next. He thought about the cold coffee she had drunk without complaint. He thought about the fact that she had watched the broadcast for exactly 11 minutes and then turned it off. Not because she had seen enough, but because she had already seen everything she needed. He stood there with that thought for a long moment. Then he went to contact the ARC committee. 14 hours after the broadcast, the council's senior analyst filed his preliminary human response assessment. It was thorough. It covers social fracture indicators, government response coherence scores, military mobilization probability windows, and projected timelines for systemic collapse. He had been working on versions of this assessment for 3 years, updating the variables as the intelligence came in, and he was confident in his numbers. His final projection read, high confidence systemic collapse within 14 cycles. Recommends standard post-engagement administrative preparation. He sent it to the council floor. He went to sleep. He did not know, because nobody had yet told him, that the forward strike fleet had transmitted its first target confirmation 6 hours ago. He did not know that 3 of the 4 primary strike targets, the ones selected specifically because they were humanity's most critical orbital infrastructure, the nodes that if removed would break the entire network apart in days, had gone dark 2 days before the fleet arrived. Not destroyed, not damaged, empty. Routine maintenance rotation, the facility log said, scheduled months in advance. Every worker, every system, every piece of hardware that could be moved, quietly, without announcement, without any pattern that a standard surveillance algorithm would flag as preparation. Just maintenance. The kind of thing that happens all the time. The kind of thing nobody looks at twice. In the council chamber, a junior logistics officer was the first one to see the strike confirmation reports. She read them twice, then she walked to her supervisor's station and stood there until he looked up. The targets were empty, she said. He took the report from her, read it. All of them? All 4 primary designations. He sat with that for a moment. File it as anomalous, he said. Run a secondary model pass. She filed it as anomalous. In the facility with no windows, Selah Voss was already in the room with the ARC committee. She had put a drive on the table. She had not said anything yet. She didn't need to. They all knew why they were there. The first strikes were beautiful, in the cold way that precise things are beautiful. The council's fleet moved through human space like a hand sweeping dust off a table. Controlled, unhurried. The targeting systems were the finest in the galaxy, built over centuries of conflict with species that had fought back hard and lost anyway. The strike commanders had done this before. Not to humans specifically, but to the general shape of the problem, a young civilization that needed to be reminded of its size. The targets had been chosen by a committee that spent 8 months on the selection. They were not civilian centers. The council was not in the business of looking cruel. These were symbols. Luna Station, the first permanent human structure off Earth, built 112 years ago with borrowed technology and unearned confidence. The Nairobi Orbital Ring, which humans called the gateway to their future, which the council called evidence of a species that needed to slow down. 3 broadcast towers in 3 capitals that had been the loudest voices against council oversight for the last decade. Hit these, the committee had decided, and the message would be clear. You are reachable. You are known. You are already losing. The strikes landed exactly where they were aimed. Luna Station was gone in 4 seconds. The Nairobi orbital ring broke in 2 and fell in a long, slow arc that the council's visual feed captured in careful detail. The 3 broadcast towers went quiet. It was precise. It was overwhelming. It was exactly what it was meant to be. And every single structure had been empty for 36 hours. The council's strike commander, a Vethrani officer named Korath, who had run 17 campaigns across 4 systems, stared at his confirmation reports for a long time. The stations had been evacuated. Not abandoned, evacuated. Systematically, quietly, through what the human facility logs listed as routine maintenance rotation. Workers pulled out in small groups over 2 weeks. Equipment transferred on standard cargo manifests. Nothing that would trigger a threat assessment flag. Nothing that looked like preparation. He sent a message to the Council's Intelligence Division. It read, "All primary targets confirmed destroyed. 0 casualties. Human evacuation of targets detected. Pre-knowledge of strike coordinates suspected. Requesting full intelligence audit." He did not panic. Korath was not a man who panicked. But he read that last line again after he wrote it. Pre-knowledge of strike coordinates. That meant one of 2 things. Either there was a leak inside the Council's planning division, which was a serious problem. Or the humans had simply known that these would be the targets, had looked at the Council's logic, and walked through it themselves, and arrived at the same answer, which was a different kind of serious problem. He sent the message. Then he ordered the second wave prepared. In the room with no windows, Sayla put the drive on the table and let the 12 people in the ARC committee look at it. They were not 12 remarkable-looking people. That was the point. They had been selected partly for competence and partly for the quality of being easy to overlook. Scientists, engineers, 2 logistics specialists. One woman, named Hartley, who had spent her career building commercial freighters, and now built things that did not appear in any public registry. They had been working together for almost a decade. They knew each other's coffee orders, and each other's weak points, and each other's specific flavor of exhaustion. They looked at the drive. 22 years, Sayla said. That was all she said for a moment. She did not explain the drive. She did not list what was on it. She did not deliver a speech. She had never been a person who delivered speeches, and the room was full of people who had been in enough bad situations to know that the speeches only come when someone needs to be convinced, and nobody in this room needed convincing anymore. The drive held everything they had built, while the Council thought they were too primitive to notice being watched. Not weapons mostly. The Council expected weapons. Species under pressure built weapons. It was in all the models. What was on the drive was harder to explain and harder to fight. Documentation, observation records, communication logs from 14 Council Protectorate species going back 19 years, financial transfer records, resource extraction data, the detailed, careful, cross-referenced evidence of what the Council actually did to the civilizations it claimed to protect. The taxes dressed as guidance fees, the territorial restrictions dressed as safety protocols, the slow and patient removal of anything a species might use to say no. And alongside all of that, ships. Not a massive fleet. Not something that could beat the Council in a straight fight, because a straight fight was never the plan. Small ships, fast ships. Ships built in places that did not appear on any Council survey. Ships designed around one specific idea, that the goal was not to match the Council's strength, but to operate in the spaces the Council's strength was too large to reach. Hartley had built most of them. She was looking at the drive with the expression of a woman who had spent 10 years being told she was building something that would never be needed. The evacuation worked, Sella said. Yes, said one of the committee members. The second wave will come. Yes. When it does, Sella said, we don't stop it. We let it hit. We let them feel certain. The room was quiet. We let them feel certain, she said again, because certain people stop looking. The junior intelligence analyst assigned to monitor human cultural transmissions was named Vera. And she was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they have not yet been told which parts of their job matter. She was cataloging human creative output, art, literature, recorded performance. And she kept running into the same thing. Across centuries, across dozens of cultures that had barely spoken to each other, across every format the humans had ever invented for telling stories. The same structure. The side with less power, fewer resources, worse odds, wins. Not in every story, but in the stories humans returned to, the ones they kept and named important, the ones they gave to their children, That shape kept appearing. The cornered one, finding a way. The one everyone counted out. Her translation matrix kept struggling with one specific word that appeared in connection with this pattern. The closest it could render was something between stubbornness and the willingness to pay a price the other side won't. She flagged it in her report as a cultural anomaly worth further study. Her supervisor read the flag and marked it low priority. She left it open in her personal files. She was the kind of person who did not close things she had not finished understanding. Outside her station window, the second wave was already moving. The Council's War College had studied every major human conflict, going back 400 years. They had read about the big ones and the small ones. They had read about the wars that ended in treaties, and the wars that ended in rubble, and the wars that technically never ended and just got quiet. They had fed it all into models. They had written papers. They had concluded, with the confidence of people who have read everything and experienced nothing, that they understood how humans fought. They understood human weapons fairly well. They understood human tactics at a basic level. What they had not understood, what had not appeared anywhere in 4 centuries of data in a form they recognized as important, was the specific, unreasonable, structural stubbornness of a human who has decided that losing is not going to happen today, regardless of what the numbers say. They found out about it in the 3rd week. The human counteroffensive launched from 7 positions simultaneously. The fleet was not large. The Council's forward commanders looked at the numbers and felt something close to relief. This was a manageable engagement, a last gesture by a species that knew it was losing, trying to land something meaningful before the end. The Council fleet moved to respond the way a large hand moves to brush away a fly. Not urgently, with proportion. The formation the human ships were flying made no sense. It was not a standard offensive shape. It was not a defensive posture. It was spread too wide to be a focused strike and too shallow to be a shield line. The Council's tactical systems ran analysis and returned a result that the lead commander had never seen before. Formation pattern, unclassified. Probability of self-destruction, 73%. Recommend engage at standard distance. The lead commander engaged at standard distance. The human formation did exactly what the model said it would do. It broke. The front ships took fire and fell back. A line collapsed inward. To the Council commanders watching the display, it looked exactly like what they expected. A failed charge, a desperate push that had run into reality. They moved forward to finish it. The formation had not collapsed. It had folded. The front ships fell back on purpose, pulling the Council fleet into the gap. And the ships that had been sitting wide on the edges, the ones that looked like stragglers, like tactical mistakes, closed in from both sides simultaneously. It was not a new idea. It was in fact an idea so old that it appeared in human military records from before they had electricity. A pincer, adjusted for 3-dimensional space, modified for speed. The Council fleet, mid-advance, suddenly had no safe direction. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, the Council had lost 11 ships. Humanity had lost 7. The numbers still favored the Council. It was not a decisive victory, but it was a victory. The first one. Vera heard about it from the feed 3 hours after it happened. She was still at her station. She had been there for 19 hours, because she had the kind of brain that could not stop pulling threads, and the thread she was pulling had gotten more interesting as the day went on. She pulled up the formation data from the battle and looked at it for a long time. Then she pulled up a piece of human historical writing that her translation system had flagged 3 weeks ago as low priority. A document about a battle fought on a flat field on a continent called Europe, in a year so long ago that the humans themselves sometimes forgot it happened. Same shape. The wide line. The bait. The fold. The close. Humans had used this exact idea before gunpowder, before metal ships, before space. They had kept it for thousands of years, not because they couldn't think of anything better, but because it worked, and they knew it worked. And when something works, humans hold on to it with both hands and refuse to let go, even when everyone around them says it's time. She wrote a new flag in her report. This one she did not mark low priority. Human tactical patterns are not improvised. They are inherited. They are tested across centuries of genuine conflict. Do not model them as the behavior of a young species. Model them as the behavior of a species that has been at war with itself for longer than we have been at war with anyone. She sent it up the chain. She did not know if anyone would read it. She sent it anyway. Sella read the casualty list that night. 7 ships. The numbers on paper were not large. In the context of a war this size, 7 ships was something the strategist could work with, could fold into projections, could absorb without changing the overall picture. She read every name on the list. She sat with the list for a long time. Reyes knocked once on the door, and she said nothing, and he understood and went away. There was a man on the list named Torres, who had been on her crew 20 years ago, before any of this, when she was still someone that the Council's diplomatic envoys called difficult, and not a constructive voice, and a person whose concerns, while noted, reflect a minority position. Torres had been the kind of crew member who remembered how everyone took their coffee, and always had a spare pen, and laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. He had believed her, back then, when almost nobody did. He had stayed. She sat with the list until the room got cold, and then she put it down and stood up. The second committee meeting was in an hour. She washed her face. She walked back into the corridor with the same flat walk she always had, the one that gave nothing away, the one that Reyes had slowly learned to read not as calm, but as controlled. She was controlled. She was not calm. There is a difference, and it matters, and the difference is that calm is something you feel, and controlled is something you choose, and she had been choosing it for 22 years, and she was going to keep choosing it for as long as the work required. The second committee meeting had one item on the agenda. They had not won the war. They had proven something. Proven that the Council could be surprised. Proven that the models were wrong in specific and useful ways. Proven that the thing the Council kept calling a doomed species was still here, still choosing, still finding the old shapes in the old records, and making them work in new space. Sella walked into the room. She put nothing on the table this time. She looked at the 11 remaining faces, and she said, again. The Council did the math, and the math was correct. They could lose ships at 3 times the rate humanity could and still win. They had more of everything. More ships, more crew, more production, more time. They were not a civilization that needed a quick victory. They had fought long wars before. They had the patience of something very large and very old, and patience, in a war of attrition, is the same thing as a weapon. So they used it. The engagement pattern changed in the 5th week. The Council stopped trying for decisive strikes. Decisive strikes required committing force, and committed force could be flanked by an enemy willing to pay for it. Instead, they applied pressure across a wide front. Constant, grinding, small engagements that humanity had to respond to, had to spend ships on, had to burn fuel and time and people addressing over and over without rest. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of war that gets written about with admiration later. It worked. Humanity held the population centers. The Ark Committee ships were fast enough and small enough to keep the Council from locking down key transit routes. But the orbital infrastructure, the stations, the relay networks, the construction platforms that had taken decades to build, took damage that couldn't be recovered in the middle of a war. Things got quieter in space the way a neighborhood gets quieter after something bad happens and people start staying inside. 90 days into the grinding phase, the committee lost 2 more members. Not in battle. Dr. Okafor had a cardiac event in his sleep. He was 61 years old, and had been working 20-hour days for 4 months, and his body made a decision that he hadn't been consulted on. Hartley, the woman who had built most of the fleet and facilities that didn't appear on any maps, sat down one morning and told Sayla she was done. Not afraid, not broken, just done in the way that a machine is done when the components have given everything they have. She handed over her documentation, complete and organized, and she left. And Sayla let her go, because making someone stay past done is how you get people who are present in the room and absent in everything that matters. 9 people now. The war did not care. The report that arrived at 0300 on a Tuesday was not a military report. Sayla had asked for it 2 months ago, and then not thought about it specifically because thinking about it would not make it arrive faster, and would make everything else harder to carry. It came from a civilian analysis team embedded with the Relief Coordination Office. It was 24 pages long. It was full of numbers that represented things that were not numbers. She read it alone. The facility was quiet at that hour. Reyes was asleep somewhere. The overnight skeleton crew made small sounds down the corridor, the kind of sounds that exist at the edge of hearing and mostly just prove that you are not completely alone. She read the report. The numbers were about people, specific people, in specific places, and what had happened to them in the last 90 days. The displacement counts, the supply disruption data broken down by sector and duration, the medical resource gap projections, the places where the grinding council pressure had not directly touched anyone, but had bent the infrastructure far enough that ordinary things stopped working, and ordinary people lived with the consequences of that in ways that did not appear in the tactical briefings. She sat with the report for a long time. She did not move for a long time. The corridor was quiet. She had known these numbers were coming. She had asked for them because she believed that a person who makes decisions without knowing the full weight of those decisions is not a strategist, but a coward dressed as one. She had wanted to know. She had been right to want to know. Knowing did not make it easier to sit with. She sat with it anyway. At some point the corridor sounds changed, and she knew without checking that it was close to 0600. She had been in the room for almost 3 hours. A knock at the door. Commander, Reyes, careful voice, the voice he used when he didn't know what he was walking into. The committee is assembled. 3 seconds passed. I'll be there, she said. She folded the report. She put it in the drawer on the left side of the desk, the one with the lock, the one that held the things she needed to remember and could not afford to think about during the meeting. She washed her face in the small bathroom off the corner of the room. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, not long, just long enough to confirm that the face she was taking into that room was the one she meant to take, and then she walked out. She put a second drive on the table. The 9 remaining committee members looked at it. This is what we haven't used yet, she said. It was not a weapon. That was the first thing she told them, because the first question anyone asks in a war, when you say, this is what we haven't used, is whether it fires, whether it explodes, whether it removes the problem with enough force to end the conversation permanently. It did not. What was on the drive was a message. 19 years of documentation, carefully assembled, cross-referenced, verified through 3 separate independent confirmation processes. Evidence of what the Council had done to every species currently under their protectorate. The word the Council used for the arrangement. The word that appeared in their public communications and their diplomatic statements, and the speeches their delegates gave to species they were in the process of managing. What the drive documented was the distance between that word and the reality underneath it. The fees, the extraction, the territorial limits dressed as safety guidance, the slow, quiet removal of any resource or capability a protectorate species might use to ask for something different. 14 species, all of it in the Council's own communications, pulled from frequencies that the Council broadcast on the assumption that nobody outside their network was listening carefully enough to understand what they were hearing. Sayla had been listening carefully for 19 years. We send this, she said, to every protectorate species simultaneously. Not to their governments, to their people, to every receiving frequency that can carry it. The room was quiet. "The Council can fight us," she said. "They have the ships for it. They have the patience for it. What they can't afford is to fight us while their supply chains stop cooperating." One of the remaining committee members, a man named Park, who had said very little in every meeting for 2 years, and whose silence always meant he was running the numbers, looked up. "If even 4 of the 14 withdraw logistical cooperation," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked back down. "Send it," he said. Vera was asleep when the message arrived on her personal console. It was from her home colony, a protectorate world called Cephas, where she had grown up in a city that sat next to a mineral extraction facility that had been operated by council-contracted firms for 40 years, and had been providing Cephas with guidance fees in exchange for the minerals since before she was born. She had grown up thinking the arrangement was normal. The message was from her mother. It contained a file. Her mother did not explain the file. She just wrote, "Someone sent this. Everyone is reading it. I thought you should see." Vera opened the file. She read it for a long time. Then she opened her analyst console and found the flag she had written weeks ago, the one about human stubbornness, the one about the willingness to pay a price the other side won't. She did not change anything she had written. She just added one line at the bottom. "I now believe this quality was not formed by war with other civilizations. I believe it was formed by something harder. I believe it was formed by years of being told they were wrong about something they were right about. I am updating my assessment of probable outcomes." She sent the updated flag. Then she sat in the dark for a while. Outside, on Cephas, her mother and everyone else were reading the same file. The Council did not surrender. They did not have a word for it. Not exactly. They had words for tactical withdrawal and strategic repositioning, and ceasefire pending review, a whole vocabulary built over centuries for the various shapes that stopping a thing can take, when you are too proud to call it what it is. But the clean, simple word, the one that means we were wrong and you won, that word did not exist in their formal diplomatic language, and that absence was not an accident. What they issued, 61 days after Sayla's drive went out across every frequency that could carry it, was a declaration of cessation of active military engagement, pending diplomatic and administrative review. It was 11 pages long. It used passive voice throughout. It described the engagement with humanity as having produced inconclusive results requiring further evaluation, and noted that a full review of protectorate administrative frameworks would be undertaken at the Council's earliest convenience. It was, word for word, the most expensive document ever written in a language that had no word for sorry. The supply chains had started going quiet in the 3rd week after the message. Not all at once, not loudly. The Council was watching for protest, for organized action, for the kind of visible resistance that their models told them to prepare for. What happened instead was quieter and harder to fight. One protectorate species stopped filing its monthly navigation data with the Council routing system. They cited administrative delays. 3 weeks later, they were still citing administrative delays. The Council sent a formal inquiry. The inquiry received a polite and detailed response that explained the delays at length without resolving them. Another species, one that operated the primary maintenance contracts for 2 Council supply depots, found that their workers had developed a persistent shortage of available hours. The contracts were technically being honored. The work was technically being done. It just took longer now, for reasons that were always, when examined individually, completely reasonable. A third species quietly declined to renew a resource extraction agreement that had been automatically renewed for 37 consecutive years. They sent a letter. The letter was polite. It cited changing internal needs. It expressed sincere hope for continued positive relations. These were not battles. They did not appear on any tactical map. No ship fired. No station went dark. The Council fleet, positioned for a long war, began to feel the particular discomfort of a very large body that is not getting enough to eat. By week 8, the logistics division had escalated twice. By week 10, the Council's senior strategist had submitted a private assessment, concluding that a protracted engagement with humanity, under current supply conditions, presented unacceptable long-term risk. By day 61, the declaration of cessation went out. Reyes read it aloud to the committee because that was his job, and he was thorough about his job. When he got to the phrase, cessation of active military engagement, pending diplomatic and administrative review, he stopped. He looked up. Sella was looking at the far wall. That's what they call a retreat, she said, when they have tenure. Park almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile that room had produced in 4 months, and it lasted about a second and a half before everyone went back to their faces. There was still work. The cessation was not peace. It was a comma, not a period, and everyone in the room was experienced enough to know the difference. The Council still existed. Their fleet was still intact. The diplomatic review they had promised would be long and slow, and built to produce as little change as possible, while appearing to produce a great deal. The receipts that Sella had sent out were real and documented and verified, and the Council would spend years attempting to contextualize them, minimize them, explain them in frameworks that made the behavior look like something other than what it was. Some of those explanations would work on some audiences. That was how these things went. But the 14 protectorate species had read the file. They had read it, and they had not unread it. Information that exists in enough places becomes impossible to erase. And Sella had made sure the file existed in enough places. It would move through those 14 civilizations the way a question moves through a person who has always been told not to ask it and has finally asked it. Slowly at first, then impossible to stop. The Council could manage a war. They could not manage a question that kept getting louder. 2 weeks after the cessation, Reyes found her in the room with no windows. He had gotten better at this. At the beginning of his posting he would knock twice, and immediately say her title, and whatever the most pressing update was. Because he was 29 and efficient, and had not yet learned that some moments require a person to stop performing their efficiency, and just be present. He knocked once. Waited. She said nothing. He opened the door anyway, because he had also learned that her silences were not always a closed door, just a door without a handle on the outside. He put coffee on the desk. Hot. He had learned that too. He did not say anything. He pulled the second chair to a reasonable distance, and sat down in a way that did not demand anything. Outside the facility, outside the windowless walls and the flat white lights and the 6 weeks of bad coffee, was doing what it does when something large ends. It was loud and disorganized and full of opinions about what had happened and what it meant, and who deserved credit, and what should happen next. It was, in other words, completely human. Sella looked at the blank screen on the wall for a while. 22 years, she said. Not to him, not exactly to the room. It was the kind of thing a person says when they need to hear it out loud, in their own voice, just once. Reyes did not say anything. He had learned when to stay quiet. It was the right temperature. She drank it. The diplomatic review had already started in a council chamber several light years away, in a room full of people who were very good at making things last a long time and produce very little. It would go on for years. There would be setbacks. There would be moments when it looked like everything was sliding back toward where it had been. There would be work, constant and unglamorous, for a very long time. She knew all of that. She sat with the hot coffee in the quiet room, and she did not say, "at last," because she had already said it, weeks ago, in the 11 minutes before she turned off the broadcast and picked up the cold coffee and walked out to start the next thing. She had said it once. That was enough. That was the whole of it, really. Not the fleet, not the receipts, not the battle in the 3rd week where an old idea from a flat field in a place called Europe had worked exactly as it was supposed to work, across the geometry of open space. All of that mattered. All of that was real. But the true weight of the thing, the part that could not be put in a tactical report or a diplomatic filing or a history that would be written later by people who had not been in this room. It was this. A woman in a windowless room. A hot coffee. Silence. 22 years of being right about something nobody wanted her to be right about. And the long, quiet, ordinary morning on the other side of it.